begins the way nightmares often begin. Quietly. Not with armies. Not with explosions. But with a ship. A ship drifting into port, sails slack, crew missing, and the air around it wrong. In 1347, people in the Mediterranean didn't know the word pandemic. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about fleas. They only knew this. Something had arrived. Something invisible and unstoppable. At first, it looks like normal sickness. A fever. A cough. A headache. Then the swellings appear. Hard, painful lumps under the arms, in the groin, in the neck. The body turns into a map of agony. Dark bruises bloom beneath the skin, like the flesh itself is dying. And then, unbelievably fast, people collapse. They bleed. They stop breathing. Sometimes within a day. Sometimes within hours. And once a household is infected, it becomes a tomb. Neighbors start whispering. Then they start running. The dead pile up so quickly that prayers can't keep up. Bells ring all day. Priests refuse to enter homes. Parents abandon children. Friends stop touching friends. Because the most terrifying thing about this disease isn't death. It's how it turns love into fear. And the world becomes something unrecognizable. Markets close. Cities lock their gates. People accuse outsiders. They accuse Jews. They accuse witches. They accuse the stars. They accuse God. Because when something this horrific happens, human beings don't just ask how. They ask who to blame. And while Europe panics, the plague spreads like smoke through a crowded room. From port to port. From street to street. From breath to breath. A black wave swallowing everything in its path. And by the time it's done, it won't just kill people. It will shatter empires, rewrite religion, collapse economies, and reshape the modern world. The Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was civilization's breaking point. Welcome back to history told like it actually felt. Not tidy, not distant, but immediate, terrifying human. Today's story is one of the darkest chapters humanity has ever lived through. The Black Death. A plague so lethal, so fast, and so psychologically devastating that people began to believe the world was ending. This is not just a story about sickness. It's a story about what happens when fear spreads faster than truth. When governments collapse under pressure. When faith cracks. When neighbors become suspects. When survival turns ordinary people into strangers. Because the Black Death didn't just kill bodies. It attacked the mind. It destroyed trust. And it forced Europe, and much of the world, to confront something it had never faced before. A catastrophe that didn't care about castles, armies, wealth, or power. For the next hour, we're going to walk through this disaster step by step. From the moment the plague enters Europe, to the panic in medieval streets, to the horrifying symptoms that made people believe they were cursed, to the social breakdown, to the massive transformation that followed. And we're going to answer a question that still chills historians. How did a microscopic killer change the entire future of civilization? Stay until the end, because the Black Death doesn't end with death. It ends with something almost as shocking, a rebirth forged out of horror. Before the Black Death arrived, Europe was already exhausted. Imagine a world without modern medicine, without sanitation, without understanding what makes a disease spread. A world where most people lived close to animals. Where streets were narrow, wet, and packed. Where waste was dumped into open gutters. Where rats lived inside walls. And fleas lived on everything. Now imagine that same world under stress. In the early 1300s, Europe had suffered a sequence of disasters that weakened society like a body weakened before infection. There was war. There was political instability. But there was also something quieter. Something that made survival harder every single day. Famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 hit much of Europe hard. Rain ruined harvests. Food shortages spread. People ate whatever they could. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, though no one called it that. They just knew their children were thin. That old people died faster. That sickness was everywhere. So when the plague arrived decades later, it didn't arrive to a strong continent. It arrived to a continent already struggling. Now add trade. Because medieval Europe wasn't isolated. It was connected by ships and roads. The Mediterranean was a highway for commerce, spices, silks, grains, and people. Ports like Genoa, Venice, and Marseille were rich because ships arrived constantly. But trade has a shadow. It carries more than goods. It carries stowaways, rats, fleas, pathogens. And those ports were crowded. Warehouses packed with grain. Markets packed with bodies. Docks packed with sailors. Everything that makes a city wealthy also makes it vulnerable. Yet the people living there had no concept of germs. When someone got sick, they didn't think about bacteria. They thought about punishment. They thought about bad air, miasma. They thought about the alignment of planets. They thought about curses. Religion dominated interpretation. And when fear dominates interpretation, facts don't stand a chance. Now picture a medieval city. The smell, the noise, the animals being slaughtered, the open drains, the packed houses, entire families sleeping in one room. And in winter, windows closed, smoke thick in the air. If one person becomes contagious, the whole household becomes exposed. And if a disease spreads through fleas and rats, the city becomes a trap. The structure of life itself becomes a conveyor belt. But the most important background truth is psychological. Medieval Europe lived with death constantly. Infant mortality was high. Injuries killed. Minor infections killed. People saw death often. But they still believed death was predictable. Death came from battle. From childbirth. From starvation. The Black Death would break that belief. Because it didn't kill in the patterns people expected. It killed priests. It killed merchants. It killed children. It killed the strong. And it did it with speed that made people feel powerless. So in 1347, when the plague sails into Europe, it doesn't arrive in a society prepared to contain it. It arrives in a society perfectly designed to amplify it. A society connected by trade, crowded by growth, weakened by hunger, and guided by superstition. A society that was about to watch its world collapse. To the people of Europe, the Black Death seemed to appear out of nowhere. One day life was hard, but familiar. The next day, it was horror. But the plague didn't come from nowhere. It came from movement, from trade, from the arteries of the medieval world. Most historians trace its origins to Central Asia, where plague existed in animal reservoirs, especially rodents. In that part of the world, it wasn't a rumor. It was a reality that could flare up when conditions were right. And in the 1340s, conditions were right. Trade routes connected Asia to the Middle East and Europe through the Silk Road and maritime routes. Caravans crossed vast land. Ships crossed seas. And wherever grain and goods traveled, rats traveled too. Then the plague reached the Black Sea. This is where the story becomes almost cinematic in its cruelty. In 1346, a conflict erupts at a trading city called Kaffa, a Genoese outpost on the Crimean Peninsula. The city is besieged by Mongol forces of the Golden Horde. And during the siege, disease breaks out in the besieging army. Later accounts claim the attackers catapulted infected corpses into the city, an early, terrifying example of biological warfare. Historians debate exactly how much that act mattered. But what isn't debated is this. Kaffa became a doorway. Genoese merchants and sailors flee the siege by ship. And on those ships, the plague travels with them. Not as a visible passenger. As something hidden. Rats in the holds. Fleas in clothing. And humans who would soon show symptoms. The ships sail across the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean, and in October 1347, they reach one of Europe's busiest ports. Messina, in Sicily. This is where European history tilts. When the ships arrive, the scene is wrong. Sailors are sick. Some already dead. Some delirious. Some covered in swellings. The people of Messina are horrified. They try to send the ships away. They order them to leave the harbor. But it's too late. The plague has already stepped onto land. And from Messina, it spreads like wildfire along the coast. To Genoa. To Venice. To Marseille. To Barcelona. Port cities light up first, like torches. Then the disease moves inland along roads. Merchants carry it. Pilgrims carry it. Refugees carry it. The plague doesn't need an army. It doesn't need conquest. It rides in wagons, ships, and pockets. Now, the people who first encounter it describe it with a kind of stunned disbelief. They don't understand how it moves. They don't understand why it spreads so fast. They only recognize the pattern. Where the sickness appears, death follows. And not weeks later, days later, sometimes within a day. Which means by the time a city realizes it has the plague, it's already inside thousands of homes. That is why the Black Death becomes a horror story. Not because it kills. Because it kills with speed that overwhelms every human system. Religion, government, and even burial. The first ports panic. They pray. They quarantine, sometimes in crude ways. They blame outsiders. They blame God. They blame demons. But none of it slows the wave. And as 1347 turns into 1348, Europe begins to understand something terrifying. This is not a local outbreak. This is a continent-wide catastrophe. At first, people try to explain it like every other sickness. The fever, they say. A bad wind. Bad air drifting in from the sea. Something in the stars. Something that will pass. But then the plague reveals its true face. And the explanations collapse. It begins with a feeling of wrongness in the body. A sudden heat. A pounding head. A weakness so heavy it feels like gravity is increasing. Then the swellings appear. Large, painful lumps that rise in places the body never expects. Under the arms, in the groin, along the neck. They are called buboes, though no one uses that word at first. People just call them the swellings. And when the swellings come, everyone knows what comes next. Because the swellings aren't just symptoms. They are countdowns. A day. 2 days. Sometimes less. Then comes the discoloration. Dark blotches on the skin, black or purple, like bruises blooming from the inside. This is where the plague earns its most terrifying name, the Black Death. To the medieval mind, black marks on the body aren't medical. They are symbolic. They look like corruption, like judgment, like the body is being claimed. And the speed is what breaks people psychologically. A cough in the morning, swelling at noon, a corpse by night. There is no time for doctors to help, even if they knew how. There is no time for priests to perform proper rites. There is no time for families to say goodbye. People die before they fully accept they are dying. And soon the streets begin to change. Not because people stop living, but because people stop trusting. Neighbors watch neighbors. A man coughs, people step back. A woman's child looks pale, families avoid her door. Business slows. Markets become quieter. Then the fear turns into something sharper. Avoidance. The sick are left behind. The dying are left behind. In some homes, parents flee and leave their children. In other homes, children flee and leave their parents. And the most haunting truth is this. In the face of a fast, invisible killer, love becomes dangerous. Touch becomes dangerous. And when touch becomes dangerous, society begins to crack. Doctors, who wear strange masks and carry herbs, become symbols of desperation more than cure. They bleed patients. They burn incense. They recommend strange mixtures. But nothing stops the wave. Priests die too. Monks die too. The plague does not respect holiness. That shakes faith. Because people look around and ask, if God protects the righteous, why are the righteous dying? And when faith shakes, fear grows. Soon, bells ring constantly. Funeral processions multiply. But then even the funerals can't keep up. Bodies begin to pile. Grave diggers become the most important workers in the city. And even they cannot dig fast enough. So pits are dug. Mass graves. The dead stacked like wood. And the living watch this happen, feeling something that is worse than panic. Helplessness. Because war is different. In war, you can see your enemy. You can fight. You can run. But the plague is everywhere. In the air, people believe. In the touch of a hand. In the cloth of a blanket. In the fleas they don't know exist. Every place feels contaminated. Every breath feels suspicious. And this is the moment the Black Death stops being a sickness and becomes a horror that reshapes behavior. Because once a city understands the plague is inside its walls, the city begins to behave like a trapped animal. And trapped animals do desperate things. When the plague takes hold, the first instinct of a city is to protect itself. Not with medicine, with walls. Gates close. Travelers are turned away. Ships are ordered to anchor offshore. Merchants are refused entry. The logic feels reasonable. If you keep the sickness out, you stay safe. But the plague doesn't announce itself at the gate. It arrives hidden. In cargo. In rats. In people who look healthy until they don't. So the defenses come too late. And once the plague is inside, cities try something new, something desperate. Quarantine. Isolation. They don't call it quarantine at first in the modern sense, but the idea spreads. Keep the infected away from the healthy. Some city authorities mark houses with signs. Some force families to stay inside. Some build plague hospitals, lazarettos, outside the main city. But none of these systems are strong enough, because the plague moves faster than bureaucracy. And the second instinct, maybe the most human instinct, rises quickly. The rich flee first. They leave the city. They retreat to estates in the countryside. They bring servants, food, and sometimes, without realizing it, they bring the plague. The poor try to flee too. Some succeed. Most cannot. They remain trapped in crowded neighborhoods where disease spreads like fire. This creates a cruel pattern. The people with the most resources have the best chance to run. The people with the least die where they stand. And as bodies pile up, the social order begins to crack. Workers refuse to work. Farmers refuse to bring grain into cities. Carriers refuse to carry bodies. Priests refuse to enter infected homes. Even family members refuse to touch each other. Then fear mutates into rage. Because when people can't control disaster, they search for someone to blame. Scapegoats appear. Rumors spread like plague itself. Some accuse foreigners. Some accuse beggars. Some accuse witches. Some accuse sinners. But one group is targeted with particular cruelty. Jewish communities. A rumor spreads that Jews have poisoned wells. It's false. It's absurd. But in the logic of terror, absurdity doesn't matter. Because the rumor provides something people crave. An explanation. And a target. And once a target exists, violence follows. In many towns and cities, Jews are attacked, expelled, or killed. Entire communities are destroyed. It's one of the darkest moral stains of the Black Death. Not just because of the violence, but because it shows how quickly human beings can turn on each other when fear becomes survival. And the irony is horrifying. Even as people murder scapegoats, the plague continues. Unmoved. Unchanged. Because the disease doesn't care who you blame. It only cares who is exposed. Meanwhile, religion reacts in extreme ways. Some people turn more devout. They pray constantly. They join processions. They beg for mercy. But others lose faith. They drink. They gamble. They commit crimes. Because if the world is ending, they think, why behave? And then a movement rises across parts of Europe. The flagellants. Groups of people marching from town to town, whipping themselves, believing their suffering will appease God and stop the plague. Their processions are dramatic, bloody, public. They terrify crowds. They also spread disease. Because they travel constantly, from city to city. So even attempts at spiritual salvation become vectors. This is the conflict trigger of the Black Death. Not just the illness itself, but the social infection. The way fear spreads. The way trust collapses. The way communities fracture. The way desperation creates brutality. And as winter turns to spring, and spring turns to summer, Europe realizes that this is not one city's nightmare. It is everyone's. The plague is moving north. Over mountains. Across rivers. Through kingdoms. And the most terrifying part is this. For the first time in living memory, death is not selective. It is everywhere. and nothing seems strong enough to stop it. By 1348, Europe begins to understand the most terrifying truth of all. There is no safe distance. At first, the plague felt like a coastal nightmare, a port problem, a sailor's curse, something brought by foreign ships and sea wind. So inland towns told themselves a comforting story. We are safe. We are away from the docks. We are away from the sea. We are away from whatever poison came on those ships. But then the plague arrives anyway, not as a rumor, as a funeral bell, as a cart filled with bodies, as a house where everyone suddenly goes silent. And it arrives the same way everywhere. First in the crowded places. First where people gather. First where rats find food. First where roads and trade meet like veins. From Sicily, it climbs into Italy. It moves through Genoa, through Venice, into Florence. And Florence, rich, cultured, proud, becomes one of the most infamous early plague cities. Boccaccio later describes a world where normal behavior collapses, where people avoid each other like poison, where the sick are abandoned, where the dead are dragged out like refuse, where even family bonds begin to break. And Florence is just one city. The plague doesn't stop there. It moves into France through Marseille, into Spain through Barcelona, into the cities of the Holy Roman Empire, into England through ships landing in the south. And the pattern repeats with brutal consistency. A ship arrives. A merchant arrives. A traveler arrives. Then the first fever. Then the first swelling. Then the first panic. Then the first mass graves. This is how it spreads, like ink poured onto a map. And medieval Europe has no way to slow it. Because the things that make civilization function are the same things that transmit disaster. Roads, markets, food, movement, community. Even help becomes dangerous. Because when a neighbor tries to care for the sick, the neighbor becomes sick. When a priest enters a house to give last rites, the priest becomes infected. When a doctor examines a patient, the doctor becomes a victim. So people begin to choose between two moral instincts, compassion or survival. And survival wins more often than anyone wants to admit. As the plague advances, an eerie rhythm emerges. In a healthy town, the first cases seem isolated. People say, it's only a few. Then a week later, those few become dozens. A week later, dozens become hundreds. And suddenly, the town realizes it is surrounded from within. Because once the rats and fleas have settled in, the plague is not something you can chase out with prayer. It is embedded. It is inside houses. Inside beds. Inside clothing. Inside warehouses. And soon, entire streets begin to die. This changes daily life into something surreal. Markets empty. Shops shut their doors. Workers vanish. Food becomes scarce because there are fewer hands to harvest and transport it. And in some places, the fear is so intense that people refuse to touch coins, refuse to touch door handles, refuse to breathe near others. But of course, they still must eat. They still must drink. They still must live beside each other. So the plague continues to feed. And as it spreads, people begin to notice something that deepens dread. It does not spare the powerful. Nobles die. Bishops die. City officials die. In a world where hierarchy is everything, this is psychologically devastating. Because medieval society is built on the belief that God has ordered the world. Kings at the top. Peasants at the bottom. Priests close to heaven. And now the plague is cutting through that order like a blade. If bishops die, if monasteries empty, if even priests flee, then what does that mean? It means either God has abandoned them, or something worse. It means no one is safe. And the sheer numbers begin to distort reality. In many areas, people describe streets filled with the stench of death. The sound of carts rolling over stone, carrying bodies. The silence of homes where entire families have vanished. And in the countryside, farms sit untended because the farmers are gone. Animals roam without owners. Fields begin to rot. Villages become ghost places. And those who survive experience a kind of emotional numbness. Because grief has a limit. You can cry for one death. You can cry for 10. But when death becomes constant, when funerals happen every hour, when names stop meaning anything because there are too many, the mind protects itself. It becomes cold, detached, survival-focused. And this emotional detachment becomes another kind of death. A death of the social fabric. Meanwhile, stories spread as fast as the disease. Some say it comes from poisoned air. Others say it comes from earthquakes releasing toxic fumes. Others blame comets. Others blame sin. And these stories create a second epidemic, panic. Cities begin taking extreme actions. Some burn fires constantly, believing smoke will cleanse air. Some carry flowers, herbs, and spices to cover the stench. Some refuse to go outside. Some roam wildly and drink, believing nothing matters anymore. And in the middle of all this, one desperate question keeps rising. How do you outrun something you cannot see? People try. They flee infected cities to the countryside. But they carry the disease. Or they arrive in villages that reject them. In some regions, travelers are attacked or turned away. Villagers guard roads with weapons. They lock gates. They treat strangers like plague itself. And so the map continues to darken. Town after town. Kingdom after kingdom. By the time the plague reaches England, it moves rapidly. Coastal towns first. Then London. And London, with its crowding, its filth, its commerce, becomes a perfect furnace for the disease. Within months, death becomes so common that burial grounds overflow. Pits are dug outside the city. Bodies stacked. Covered with lime. Covered with earth. And still not enough. And the most horrifying part isn't just what happens, but how quickly people adjust. At first, a death shocks. Then death becomes normal. And when death becomes normal, the world becomes unrecognizable. This is the build-up. The plague spreading like an unstoppable wave. People realizing there is no safe distance. And the world beginning to shift into survival mode. Because the Black Death is not just killing people, it is rewriting what it means to be human inside society. As the plague spreads, something happens that changes everything. The rules of life stop working. Normal life in medieval Europe depends on routines. Markets opening. Fields being planted. Church bells guiding days. Neighbors sharing labor. Families caring for each other. But the Black Death attacks the foundation of all of it. Proximity. And when proximity becomes dangerous, every human system begins to collapse. In countless towns, people begin to vanish street by street. One house is infected, then the next, then the whole lane. Doors stay closed. Windows stay shut. A smell begins to linger, sweet, rotten, unmistakable. And soon, the dead are not hidden. They are everywhere. At first, families try to do what they've always done. They wash bodies. They pray. They hold funerals. They bury the dead with dignity. But the plague moves too quickly. When one person dies, there are already 3 more coughing. By the time a priest finishes one funeral, another family is already screaming. And priests themselves begin to fall. Some die while giving last rites. Some flee. Some refuse. And when religion cannot keep up, people feel abandoned by the one institution they trusted most. The doctors are helpless too. Medieval medicine is a mix of tradition, superstition, and limited observation. They believe in imbalance of humors. They believe in contaminated air. They prescribe bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and strange rituals. Some wear protective clothing. Some carry flowers and spices to protect themselves from bad air. But none of it works. In fact, many doctors die quickly because they spend time near the infected. So the people who are supposed to help become victims. That creates panic, and panic creates rumors. Rumors that the plague is caused by witchcraft. Rumors that it is a curse. Rumors that the end times have arrived. Some people gather in churches to pray harder. Others decide churches are dangerous because crowds mean exposure. Some people isolate completely. They seal themselves in homes, refusing contact. They stock food if they can. They avoid even their family. Others do the opposite. They decide nothing matters. They drink. They feast. They gamble. They commit crimes. They live like tomorrow doesn't exist. Boccaccio describes how some people in Florence gathered in private houses, eating and singing while the city died around them. It's not because they were evil. It's because terror can produce extremes. Some people cope by becoming devout. Others cope by becoming numb. Meanwhile, burial breaks down. This is one of the most horrifying transformations. Because burial is not just a practical act. It is spiritual. It is social. It is the final dignity of a human being. But the plague produces so many bodies that dignity becomes impossible. Gravediggers can't keep up. Coffins run out. Wood runs out. People begin burying multiple bodies in one grave. Then pits. Mass graves. Bodies stacked. Covered quickly. And when burial becomes rushed, the city begins to smell like death. A smell that penetrates clothing. That clings to walls. That makes even the living feel contaminated. And that smell becomes a psychological weapon. Because it tells you constantly, this is real. This is here. This is not stopping. In some places, the living stop visiting the sick entirely. They leave food at doors. They shout through windows. They treat the infected like ghosts. Sometimes they abandon entire households. And this creates haunting scenes. A person dying alone, listening to footsteps fade away. A child crying in a house where everyone else is dead. A neighbor hearing it and choosing not to enter. Not because they don't care, but because they do care about surviving. And the cruelest part is that the plague turns ordinary compassion into a potential death sentence. So fear infects morality. People begin to calculate love. They begin to calculate duty. And in doing so, society changes. Even language changes. The way people speak. The way they look at each other. The way they react to a cough. The plague becomes a constant presence, like a shadow in every conversation. And as months pass, another horror appears. The survivors begin to experience a strange transformation. At first, people mourn. But eventually, mourning becomes impossible. Too many dead. Too constant. People become numb. They stop naming the dead. They stop listing them. They stop counting. Because counting hurts. So the mind protects itself by moving forward, even if forward feels meaningless. This numbness changes behavior in ways that last beyond the plague itself. It trains people to accept extreme loss. It trains them to distrust closeness. It trains them to expect catastrophe. And that psychological shift will echo for generations. And then, finally, the plague reaches a terrifying peak. In many regions, historians estimate that between a third and a half of the population dies. Think about that. 1 out of every 3 people you know. Maybe more. Entire professions vanish. Entire families vanish. Entire villages vanish. In some places, fields remain unplanted because the laborers are dead. In some places, animals wander without owners. In some places, towns shrink so dramatically that buildings are abandoned. And in that ruin, something strange begins to happen. People start noticing that the world is not just collapsing. It is changing. And the most dangerous changes are still ahead. Because once the plague wave begins to recede, Europe will wake up in a new reality. A reality where death has rewritten economics, power, and belief. And that is when the Black Death becomes not just a disaster, but a revolution. By the time the plague reaches its peak, Europe feels like it's been placed inside a slow, suffocating nightmare. Not the kind where you wake up sweating. The kind where you wake up, and it's still happening. In city after city, the same sequence unfolds, so predictably that survivors begin to recognize it like weather. First, whispers. Then the first deaths. Then an eruption. Then a collapse. And once the collapse begins, it doesn't stop until the city is almost unrecognizable. Imagine being inside one of those cities at the peak. The soundscape alone would haunt you. Not the noise of markets, but the constant ringing of bells. Not occasional mourning, but a continuous hum of grief. People stop asking, who died? They ask, who's still alive? At the height of the plague, the living begin to move differently. They walk faster. They avoid eye contact. They breathe shallowly, as if the air itself is contaminated. They cover their faces with cloth and herbs. They cling to superstitions as if they are armor. And the streets, normally full of movement, begin to hollow out. You don't see children playing. You don't see crowds. You see small groups moving with urgency and then disappearing back behind doors. In some districts, entire neighborhoods go silent. Not because people are sleeping, because people are gone. This is when the plague begins to overwhelm law and government. Because medieval governance is not a machine. It's people, officials, clerks, guards. And when those people die, governance evaporates. Courts stop functioning. Taxes stop being collected. City councils shrink. Orders are issued, but no one enforces them. Even the basic rituals of authority, proclamations, public gatherings, become dangerous. So the state becomes thin. And when the state becomes thin, crime finds space. Some people loot abandoned houses. Some steal food. Some break into churches. Because fear weakens morality. And hunger sharpens it. But even crime feels strange in a plague city. Because a thief can steal jewelry from a corpse. But what does jewelry mean when you might be dead tomorrow? So many crimes become about essentials. Food, warm clothing, shelter, survival. At the same time, the church, Europe's great stabilizing institution, begins to falter. Not because the church disappears. Because its priests die. In some places, monasteries become death traps. Monks caring for the sick are infected. Whole communities vanish. In some regions, so many clergy die that the church begins replacing them quickly, sometimes with men who are barely trained. That weakens faith in the institution. Because when the church is desperate, its authority begins to feel human, not divine. And for ordinary people, that is a psychological earthquake. Because medieval Europe's worldview is built on the idea that God has order. That the church is the bridge between heaven and earth. So when priests flee, or when new priests arrive who seem inexperienced, or when last rites can't be performed, people feel spiritually abandoned. And abandonment, in a crisis, becomes rage. Some people blame corrupt priests. Some blame sinful communities. Some blame a world that has fallen out of God's favor. This is when apocalyptic thinking explodes. The plague becomes interpreted as the end of days. People talk about judgment, about signs, about prophecy. They look at the sky for comets. They interpret earthquakes as warnings. They look for meaning because meaning is the only thing that makes suffering bearable. And when meaning can't be found, people create it. This is how superstition becomes a weapon. This is how scapegoating becomes a solution. This is how violence becomes holy. And in that environment, rumors can kill. A whisper that a certain group caused the plague can trigger a massacre. A rumor that a certain well is poisoned can lead to executions. A rumor that a certain woman is a witch can end in fire. Because when rational systems collapse, the human mind grabs onto stories. And stories, under fear, become sharp. Now imagine the impact on a family. A father who leaves home to find food. He returns to find his wife sick. He touches her and becomes sick. His children watch this happen and feel fear twist into their bones. One child runs. One child stays. One child survives. One child doesn't. And later, when the survivor grows up, the memory of those days doesn't vanish. It becomes part of their personality, their worldview, their relationship to trust. Multiply that by millions, and you begin to understand why the Black Death doesn't just kill bodies. It shapes the future. At the peak of the plague, burial becomes almost industrial. This is where the horror becomes so physical that it enters legend. Bodies are carried out on carts, thrown into pits, covered quickly, sometimes without names, sometimes without prayer, sometimes without clothing. Grief is compressed. Because grief takes time, and time is a luxury no one has. In London, later excavations reveal mass burial pits from the plague era, evidence of just how overwhelmed the city became. In other regions, Chroniclers describe stacks of dead so high that people feared the air itself was poisoned by decay. And this creates one of the most terrifying psychological effects. The dead begin to feel more present than the living. The living become fewer. The dead become a constant landscape. You can't escape them. Every path passes a cart. Every churchyard is full. Every bell reminds you. So people begin to behave in extremes again. Some become obsessed with cleanliness, washing, burning, purifying. Some become obsessed with sin, confession, ritual, penance. Some become obsessed with pleasure, because tomorrow might not arrive. This is the moment where society feels like it's splitting into multiple realities. And within that split, the medieval world starts to crack open. Because the Black Death does something more revolutionary than death. It changes value. Labor becomes scarce. And scarcity changes power. When a third to half of the population dies, suddenly the survivors matter more. The peasant who once had no leverage, now does. A worker who once could be replaced, now cannot. A lord who once commanded endless labor, now struggles to find hands to harvest. And this shift terrifies the ruling class. Because feudalism depends on abundance of labor. It depends on peasants being disposable. But the plague turns peasants into something precious, the workforce. And this begins a slow transformation that will reshape European society. At first, the upper classes try to resist. They attempt wage controls. They attempt laws that force peasants to work. In England, for example, later laws like the Statute of Labourers will try to freeze wages and keep the old order intact. But the pressure is too strong. The world has changed. You cannot force a labor shortage to disappear. The surviving workers know their value. They demand better pay. They demand better conditions. They leave manors. They move to cities. They negotiate. They resist. And this begins the long erosion of the feudal system. But in the moment, the survivors don't describe it as revolution. They describe it as desperation, as chaos, as a strange new world where rules feel broken. And the ruling class responds the way ruling classes often respond when they feel threatened. With control, with punishment, with attempts to restore the past. But the past is dead. It's buried in plague pits. And the future is forcing itself into existence. At the peak of the Black Death, this is not yet fully visible. What is visible is the exhaustion, the emptiness, the sense that Europe is walking through its own graveyard. Then, slowly, unevenly, something begins to happen. In some regions, the death rate begins to slow. Not because anyone found a cure, because the plague wave has burned through so many bodies that it temporarily runs out of hosts. That doesn't mean it disappears. It will return in waves. But the first great wave begins to ebb. And when it does, survivors crawl out of hiding and look around at their world. And barely recognize it. Whole families are missing. Farms are empty. Priests are dead. Villages are half gone. And the silence is different now. Not the silence of fear. The silence of absence. This is the cliff edge of the buildup. Because the Black Death is about to shift from immediate horror to long-term transformation. The medieval world, socially, economically, psychologically, is about to rebuild itself. But it will rebuild differently. And many of the modern structures we recognize will be born from that rebuilding. But before the rebuilding comes, there is a turning point, a moment when survivors realize the old world is not coming back. When the plague begins to recede, the surviving world doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like waking up after a fire and realizing your home is still standing, but everything inside is ash. Survivors step out into streets that look familiar, but sound wrong. Too quiet, too empty, too many doors that never open again. This is the turning point. Not because the plague ends, because it doesn't. It will return in waves for centuries. But because the first great wave changes Europe permanently. And the twist is this. The Black Death doesn't just destroy. It rearranges power. Because death doesn't just remove people. It removes the old balance. Think about labor. Before the plague, Europe had a large population and not enough land or opportunity for everyone. Workers were cheap. Peasants were trapped. If you refused your lord's demands, you could be replaced. But after the plague, there are fewer workers. And suddenly, the surviving workers are valuable. The fields still need planting. The animals still need tending. The towns still need rebuilding. And there aren't enough hands. So wages rise. Conditions improve. Peasants start negotiating. They move to better farms. They demand payment. They demand freedom. For the lower classes, it's strange. Almost unbelievable. Because for the first time, the powerless feel leverage. And for the ruling class, it's terrifying. Because the entire feudal system relies on control. So landlords and kings respond with laws. They try to force wages down. They try to freeze workers in place. They try to restore the old order like a man trying to rebuild a collapsed wall with bare hands. In England, the Statute of Labourers attempts to legally force workers back into pre-plague wage levels. But laws can't change reality. The labor shortage is real. And the people know it. This tension becomes the seed of future revolts. Because once people taste leverage, they never forget it. Now look at religion. The church suffers massive losses. Priests die. Monasteries empty. Rituals break. And in some regions, church authority weakens because people have watched clergy fail to protect them. They have watched prayer fail. They have watched holy men flee. This doesn't destroy religion, far from it. But it changes it. It makes people question. It makes people demand answers. And when institutions fail during catastrophe, skepticism grows. That skepticism will later help fuel reform movements, criticism of corruption, and eventually, the slow reshaping of European Christianity. The plague also changes medicine and inquiry. Not immediately. No one suddenly invents germ theory. But people begin to observe patterns. Some notice that those who isolate sometimes survive. Some notice that people who flee early sometimes avoid infection. Some begin to record symptoms and spread. These observations don't stop the plague, but they plant something important. A culture of documenting disaster. And documentation becomes knowledge over time. Then there's the psychological twist. After living through mass death, survivors change. They become more risk-tolerant in some ways. Because fear has already happened. They've already seen the worst. So they are willing to take chances. To move. To change jobs. To break old social expectations. And at the same time, some become obsessed with death. Art changes. Culture changes. The dance of death, imagery rises, skeletons leading kings and peasants alike into graves. Because now death is not an occasional visitor. It is a constant character in society. And that shifts how people think about life. How they spend money. How they express faith. How they create art. This is why the Black Death is one of the great pivot points in world history. It forces Europe to reconsider itself. And out of that reconsideration, new social structures begin emerging. Cities begin to grow again, but differently. Guilds and labor become more powerful. The economy begins shifting in ways that eventually contribute to the rise of a more modern commercial system. The plague, ironically, accelerates change. And this is what makes the story almost cruelly poetic. A disaster that kills millions also creates opportunities for the survivors. Not because the disaster is good, but because when a system is broken, it has to rebuild. And rebuilding creates openings. So the turning point is not a single moment. It's a slow, pressure-driven transformation. Europe doesn't just recover. Europe becomes different. And the old medieval world, the one defined by rigid hierarchy and stagnant labor, begins to loosen. But this transformation doesn't happen peacefully. Because when power shifts, conflict follows. The ruling class pushes back. Workers resist. And the seeds planted in plague pits will eventually bloom into uprisings. Rebellions. A new relationship between labor and authority. And if you zoom out far enough, you can argue that the Black Death becomes one of the forces that helps Europe transition toward the modern era. Not by design. By consequence. The plague breaks the world. And the survivors rebuild it into something else. When the plague releases its grip, Europe doesn't return to normal. It can't. Too many bodies are gone. Too many rules are broken. Too many survivors have seen the truth. The old world was not permanent. And once people realize the old world can collapse, they stop obeying it the same way. This is where the Black Death becomes more than tragedy. It becomes tension, conflict, a battle over the future. Because after the plague, the survivors don't just want to live. They want to live better. They want fair pay. They want freedom to move. They want relief from oppressive obligations. But the ruling class, lords, landowners, kings, want the opposite. They want the past back. They want labor cheap again. They want peasants controlled again. They want order restored. And here's the brutal truth. They can't restore it. The shortage of workers is real. So the ruling class turns to something it still has. Force. Punishment. In places like England, the government passes laws to freeze wages, to force workers to accept old pay levels, to punish idle laborers, to stop peasants from moving to better jobs, to legally trap them. But this creates a new kind of rage. Because the workers know their value now. They know the fields don't run without them. So the laws feel like chains. And when chains are tightened on people who've tasted leverage, something snaps. This is the climax of the Black Death's social impact. Because the plague doesn't end when the sick stop dying. It continues as a conflict between those who want change and those who want control. In the decades after the first wave, labor disputes intensify. Peasants demand higher wages. They refuse to work. They leave estates. They negotiate as if they matter, because now they do. And the ruling class responds with crackdowns. This pressure builds until it erupts into open rebellion. In England, the most famous eruption comes in 1381. The Peasants' Revolt. It isn't a direct continuation of the plague. But the plague is the spark that made it possible. Because the population drop shifted power. And once power shifts, old hierarchies become unstable. The Peasants' Revolt is fueled by many things. Taxes, oppression, frustration. But underneath it is the transformation the plague began. A rising belief among common people that they deserve more than survival. That they deserve dignity. And that belief terrifies elites. Because elites understand that once people stop accepting their place, control becomes harder to maintain. And the conflict isn't only economic. It's psychological. The plague changed how people view authority. When priests died, faith in the church weakened in some places. When lords fled estates, loyalty weakened. When governments failed to prevent disaster, legitimacy cracked. So after the plague, people are more willing to challenge leaders, to question institutions, to resist. And that resistance creates a new kind of instability across Europe. Meanwhile, fear hasn't vanished. The plague still returns. Outbreaks flare. Cities panic again. People still flee. So the trauma becomes cyclical. Survivors live in a world where disaster is no longer unimaginable. It's expected. And that expectation shapes behavior. Some become intensely religious. Others become skeptical. Some build fortunes from abandoned land. Others fall into poverty because their families are gone. Society becomes uneven, shifting, fragile. But in that fragility, one thing becomes clear. Europe is changing. And it's changing because of a disease. Not a king. Not a war. Not a treaty. A microscopic killer has forced civilization to restructure itself. The emotional climax is this. The Black Death did not just kill people. It killed the certainty that the old world would always exist. And once certainty dies, history accelerates. New ideas spread faster. New social arrangements become possible. People move. Cities reshape. Labor gains power. Institutions begin to face pressure. And while the ruling class fights back, the direction of change can't be reversed. The plague has already rewritten the foundation. So the climax of this story is not one dramatic event. It's an explosion of consequences. A society struggling violently to decide what it will become after trauma. And the final question hanging in the air is this. If a disease can reshape civilizations so completely, what else can? When the first wave of the Black Death passes, Europe is not healed. It's altered. Like a landscape after an earthquake, still recognizable, but shifted in ways that change everything. The most obvious impact is demographic. Millions are dead. In many places, between a third and half of the population is gone. That number is so enormous it's almost impossible to visualize. It means empty villages, abandoned farms, vacant houses in cities. It means a world where silence appears in places that used to hum with life. But the deeper impact is structural. Because when population collapses, the entire economic engine changes. Land becomes more available. Labor becomes scarce. And scarcity gives workers leverage. For peasants and laborers, this creates a rare window. They can demand wages. They can leave abusive landlords. They can negotiate. And they do. In the long run, this helps weaken feudalism. Not overnight, but like a crack spreading through stone. Feudalism depended on surplus labor and limited options. The plague breaks that surplus. Suddenly, the old model is harder to maintain. This shift also affects cities. Many cities shrink at first. But over time, urban life adapts. Guilds become more influential. Skilled labor becomes more valuable. Merchants who survive can acquire property and expand wealth. Some families rise rapidly because their competitors died. Others collapse because their heirs are gone. So society becomes unstable but also dynamic. And in that dynamism, Europe begins inching toward a more modern economic system. More mobile, more wage-driven, more dependent on contracts than rigid obligations. Religion also transforms. The church remains powerful, but its aura of certainty is damaged. People watched priests die. Watched prayers fail. Watched corruption survive. This fuels skepticism. It also fuels intense devotion in some areas. You see both extremes, deeper piety and deeper doubt. And over generations, those cracks will contribute to later reform movements and religious upheaval. Culture changes too. Art becomes haunted by death. You see the rise of death imagery, skeletal figures, danse macabre, reminders that no rank can escape the grave. Literature becomes darker. More focused on fragility. More focused on fate. Because when a society experiences mass death, it cannot pretend life is stable anymore. Medicine and public health shift slowly. Again, no one suddenly understands bacteria. But cities begin experimenting with isolation practices, lazarettos, and more organized responses to outbreaks. Record-keeping improves. Authorities begin tracking deaths and contagion patterns. These early responses become part of the long evolution toward public health systems. And the plague changes psychology permanently. Survivors carry trauma. They have lived through mass loss. They have seen neighborhoods emptied. And that experience shapes how future generations view risk, faith, authority, and death. The Black Death also reshapes politics. Some rulers gain power by seizing abandoned lands. Others face uprisings because of taxes and labor control attempts. States begin adjusting to the reality that controlling a smaller, more valuable population requires different methods. So in the end, the Black Death becomes a paradox. A catastrophe that destroys millions, but also accelerates transformation. It collapses old systems and forces new ones to form. And when you look at European history after the 14th century, you can see the plague's fingerprints everywhere. In wage labor, in social mobility, in shifts in religious authority, in cultural obsession with mortality, in revolts and power changes. The Black Death is not the only reason Europe changes, but it is one of the biggest shocks that pushes it forward. It is the earthquake that loosens the medieval world and helps open the path toward the modern one. The Black Death feels medieval, but the patterns it revealed are painfully modern, because what the plague exposed wasn't just biology. It exposed behavior. It exposed the way human beings react when fear becomes universal. The first modern lesson is simple. When people don't understand a crisis, they invent explanations. In the 14th century, people blamed bad air, comets, sin, witches, and outsiders. They didn't know about bacteria or fleas. So their minds filled the gap with stories. And those stories weren't harmless. They shaped policy. They shaped violence. They shaped survival. Today, the technologies are different. We have microscopes. We have labs. We have data. But the psychological pattern remains. When fear rises faster than clarity, rumors spread, misinformation spreads, and people still search for someone to blame. That's why scapegoating during the Black Death is one of the most important warnings in history. Because in crisis, human beings often choose targets over truth. And once that happens, the social damage can outlast the disease itself. The second lesson is about systems. The Black Death didn't only kill individuals. It stressed every system at once. Food supply, labor, religion, medicine, economy, government. That's what makes large-scale pandemics so destabilizing. They don't just create illness. They create chain reactions. When workers die, harvests fail. When harvests fail, hunger rises. When hunger rises, unrest grows. When unrest grows, governments crack. And that chain reaction is still relevant now. Because modern societies, despite technology, still depend on fragile systems. Global supply chains, healthcare capacity, public trust, communication. And if those systems fail together, you get panic. You get political instability. You get social fracture. The third lesson is that disasters can accelerate change. The Black Death pushed Europe out of certain medieval structures faster than it might have shifted naturally. It forced wage labor growth. It weakened rigid feudal control. It changed cities. It changed religious authority. And you can see similar acceleration in modern crises. Major disruptions don't always create trends. They speed them up. They shake loose what was already unstable. The Black Death also shows us something uncomfortable. Human progress often grows out of trauma. Not because trauma is good, but because when the world breaks, people rebuild differently. And finally, the Black Death is a reminder of something we forget too easily. Civilization is not guaranteed. It feels stable because we are born into it. But history shows stability can vanish quickly. A disease, a famine, a war, a chain reaction, and suddenly the rules of life change. That's why the Black Death still matters. It is a mirror, a reminder that fear is contagious, that systems are fragile, that scapegoating is dangerous, and that survival can reshape society in ways no one predicts. The medieval world thought it was living through the end of time. In some ways it was, because the world they knew ended, and something new was born from the ruins. And if we pay attention, we can recognize those patterns before we repeat the worst parts. And that was the Black Death. A catastrophe so vast that it didn't just kill millions. It rewrote what civilization was allowed to be. It changed how people worked, how people prayed, how people trusted, how people feared. And the most haunting part is that it didn't need an army. It didn't need a king. It didn't need conquest. It arrived quietly, and the world had to transform to survive it. If you enjoyed this kind of immersive history storytelling, dark, suspenseful, deeply human, make sure you subscribe. Because we're going deeper into the moments where the world almost breaks and what happens after. Next, we're telling a story that feels like medieval horror. But it's also one of the greatest mysteries of all time. A city buried in ash. A day that froze in time. And a disaster so sudden that people were caught mid-step. From it. Not just the eruption, but the lives that vanished in a single afternoon. If you want that story, subscribe now. And if you made it all the way through the Black Death, comment the word plague. I read the comments. And it tells me you want more 1-hour cinematic stories where history feels like you're living inside it.